The Velcran fleet appeared at the edge of human space without warning, and their arrival sent shockwaves through every colony in the outer systems. 300 warships emerged from the darkness, and each vessel was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Their hulls were black as midnight and covered in weapons that could turn planets into dust. The Velcrons had conquered 47 star systems in less than 10 years, and their reputation preceded them across the galaxy. Supreme Commander Zethus stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the small blue planet in the distance. Earth was just another conquest in his long career, and he expected this to be quick and simple. Every species they encountered followed the same pattern: shock, fear, desperate negotiation, and finally surrender. The humans would be no different. The message was broadcast across all frequencies in every human language. The Velcran ultimatum was clear and brutal: surrender within 72 hours or face total annihilation. Zethus had delivered this speech dozens of times before, and he always enjoyed watching the responses. Some species begged immediately, and others tried to sound brave while their voices trembled with fear. But they all responded, and they all eventually surrendered. Deep beneath the mountains of North America, Admiral Marcus Grant stood in the War Command Center and watched the alien fleet on the holographic display. The room was filled with military leaders from every nation on Earth, and all of them waited for his decision. President Helen Morris had given him complete authority to handle the situation, and the weight of humanity's survival rested on his shoulders. General Carl Hughes stepped forward, and his weathered face showed concern. The general had fought in 3 wars and seen countless battles, but this was different. These were not human enemies with human weaknesses and human limitations. These were aliens with technology that seemed almost magical, and a military record that was perfect. The communications officer played the Velcran message again, and the translated words filled the room. The alien voice was cold and mechanical and absolutely certain of victory. They had given humanity 3 days to surrender, and the clock was already ticking. Marcus studied the formation of enemy ships and noticed how they were arranged. The Velcrans had positioned themselves in a pattern designed to look impressive and intimidating. Their largest ships were in the front, and their weapons were clearly visible. This was not a battle formation, but a display meant to inspire fear and hopelessness. Captain Lisa Morgan was the youngest officer in the room, and she looked at the admiral with confusion. She had expected immediate action, or at least some kind of response to the alien threat. Instead, Marcus just stood there and stared at the display in silence. Carl spoke up and suggested they should at least acknowledge the transmission. Every protocol they had ever learned said that communication was the first step in any conflict. Silence could be interpreted as technical failure or confusion, and might provoke an earlier attack. Marcus turned to face the room, and his expression was calm and controlled. He gave his order in a quiet voice that somehow carried more weight than any shout. All human military forces would maintain complete radio silence, and there would be no response to the Velcran ultimatum. No negotiations and no acknowledgement and no transmission of any kind. The room erupted in whispered conversations, and several officers looked shocked. This went against every instinct and every bit of training they had received. Lisa asked if they should at least send some kind of reply, and Marcus simply shook his head. He explained his reasoning in simple terms. The Velcrons expected fear, and they expected humanity to follow the same pattern as every other species they had conquered. By saying nothing at all, the humans would break that pattern and create uncertainty in the enemy's mind. Silence was the one response the aliens had never encountered. On the Velcran flagship, communications officers monitored all human frequencies and waited for the inevitable response. The first hour passed with nothing but normal civilian traffic. Colonists talking to their families, and cargo ships coordinating deliveries, and news broadcasts discussing the alien arrival, but not a single military transmission, and not one word directed at the Velcran fleet. Zethus was not concerned at first because some species took time to organize their governments and prepare their surrender. He had encountered delays before, when primitive political systems struggled to make decisions. But as the second day approached with continued silence, he began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. His second-in-command reported that they had detected no change in human military activity. The defense fleets remained in their normal positions, and planetary installations showed no signs of heightened alert. It was as if the humans did not care about the massive alien armada sitting at their doorstep. Zethus reviewed the intelligence reports on humanity again and looked for anything he might have missed. The humans had achieved spaceflight only 200 years ago, and their technology was primitive by galactic standards. They had no history of interstellar conflict and no experience with species like the Velcrans. By all logic, they should be terrified. The silence continued through the second day and into the third. Zethus found himself staring at the communications array and waiting for something that never came. His crew began to whisper among themselves, and the uncertainty spread through the fleet like a disease. This had never happened before, and no one knew what it meant. On Earth, Marcus received reports from every military installation in human space. His orders were being followed perfectly, and not a single commander had broken radio silence. More importantly, other preparations were proceeding according to plan. Ships were moving into position and weapon systems were being activated, and soldiers were preparing for what would come next. Lisa approached the Admiral and asked what would happen when the 72 hours expired. Marcus looked at her and smiled grimly. The Velcrans would have to make a choice and either attack or demand a response. Either way, they would be acting from a position of confusion rather than confidence. The deadline approached, and Zethus made his decision. He ordered scout ships to be deployed throughout human space. If the humans would not talk, then the Velcrans would gather intelligence by force. Small and fast reconnaissance vessels launched from the fleet and spread out toward human colonies and military installations. In the War Command Center, radar operators detected the scout ships immediately and reported their movements to Marcus. The Admiral nodded and gave a simple order. The scouts were not to reach their destinations, and they were not to report back to the Velcran fleet. The trap was ready, and the enemy had just made their first mistake. The Velcran scout ships moved deeper into human territory, and their sensors swept across planets and moons and asteroid fields. Each small vessel carried a crew of 3 and was equipped with advanced stealth technology that had never failed before. They had conducted reconnaissance missions in hundreds of star systems and always returned with valuable intelligence. The first scout to disappear was investigating the Mars Orbital Defense Network. One moment it was transmitting data about human military installations, and the next moment, there was nothing. No distress call and no explosion and no debris. The ship simply ceased to exist. Zethus waited for the report that never came and ordered the next scout to investigate. That vessel vanished as well, and then another and another. Within 6 hours, all 12 scout ships had gone. Silent, and the Velcran commander felt true fear for the first time in his long military career. What Zethus did not know was that humanity had been preparing for this moment for decades. Ever since humans had developed faster-than-light travel, they had watched the galaxy and studied every conflict they could observe. They had seen the Velcran conquests and analyzed their tactics and learned their weaknesses. Lieutenant Jake Bennett sat in the cockpit of his fighter and watched his instruments carefully. His ship was powered down to minimal levels and drifting among the wreckage of old mining equipment. To any sensor sweep, he would appear to be just another piece of debris floating in the asteroid field. Around him in the darkness were thousands of other fighters doing the same thing. The entire Earth defense fleet had scattered throughout the outer system and hidden themselves in plain sight. They had been holding position for 3 days now and waiting for the order to strike. Jake's wingman was Lieutenant Amy Ross, and her fighter was less than a kilometer away, though he could barely see it. They had trained together for 2 years and knew each other's flying styles perfectly. The waiting was hard, but they both understood the importance of patience. On Mars, Colonel Ryan Hayes oversaw the final preparations of the planetary defense system. Giant railguns had been disguised as industrial mining equipment for 20 years, and the Velcrans had no idea they existed. Each weapon could accelerate a projectile to incredible speeds, and the kinetic impact alone could destroy the largest warship. Major Claire Evans worked on the targeting calculations, and her team had spent months programming firing solutions for every possible scenario. They knew exactly where each Velcran ship was positioned, and exactly how to hit them for maximum effect. Ryan watched the countdown timer and knew that hundreds of other commanders were watching similar displays across human space. Everything had to happen simultaneously, or the element of surprise would be lost. Admiral Grant had planned every detail and left nothing to chance. Back on Earth, Marcus received confirmation that all units were in position. The human fleet had achieved something remarkable by moving hundreds of warships into attack range without being detected. The Velcrans were so confident in their sensor technology that they never considered the possibility of human stealth capabilities. The key to the strategy was understanding how the enemy thought. The Velcrans believed that primitive species would fight with primitive tactics, and they expected human ships to be loud and obvious. Instead, the humans had gone completely dark and used the natural features of space to mask their presence. President Helen Morris joined Marcus in the command center and looked at the tactical display. Red icons showed Velcran positions while blue icons showed human forces. The aliens were completely surrounded and had no idea. She asked if there was any chance the enemy would surrender without a fight. Marcus shook his head slowly. The Velcrans had built their entire empire on fear and intimidation, and they would never back down from what they saw as an inferior species. The only way to stop them was to hit them so hard and so fast that resistance became impossible. On the Velcran flagship, Zethus called an emergency meeting of his senior officers. The loss of the scout ships was troubling but not yet critical. He proposed sending a larger force to investigate and demanded answers about how primitive humans could have destroyed advanced Velcran vessels. His tactical officer suggested that perhaps the humans had help from another spacefaring race. It was the only explanation that made sense, because Earth's technology should not be capable of defeating Velcran stealth systems. Zethus considered this possibility and decided to proceed with caution. He ordered the fleet to move into a defensive formation and prepared to send a squadron of warships to investigate the Mars system. The movement took 30 minutes to coordinate, and during that time the Velcran ships repositioned themselves into what they considered an impenetrable defensive arrangement. What they did not realize was that their new formation actually made them more vulnerable to the attack that was coming. The human commanders watched as the enemy ships moved exactly where the pre-calculated firing solutions predicted they would go. Every movement the Velcrans made had been anticipated and planned for. Jake received a priority message on his secure channel and saw that the attack order had been given. All units were weapons-free and the countdown to engagement had begun. He powered up his fighter systems gradually and felt the engines warm up beneath him. Around him, the darkness came alive as thousands of human vessels dropped their stealth fields simultaneously. The debris and asteroids that the Velcrans had ignored suddenly revealed themselves to be warships and fighters and missile platforms. The trap had been sprung. Amy's voice came over the comm and she reported that her weapons were hot and ready. Jake acknowledged and checked his own systems one final time. Every missile was armed and every gun was loaded and his fighter was ready for combat. On Mars, Ryan gave the order to fire, and the railguns spoke with thunder that shook the red planet. Projectiles launched into space at speeds that made them almost impossible to intercept, and each one was aimed at a specific target that had been chosen months ago. The Velcran sensors finally detected the human ships, but by then it was far too late. Zethus stared at his tactical display in horror as hundreds of hostile contacts appeared from nowhere. His ships were surrounded and outnumbered and positioned perfectly for slaughter. He opened his mouth to give orders, but the first impacts hit before he could speak. Railgun slugs traveling at relativistic speeds tore through Velcran shields like they were paper. The kinetic energy was so massive that entire ships simply disintegrated on impact. Human missile swarms followed, and each weapon was guided by artificial intelligence that could adapt to enemy countermeasures. The Velcran point defense systems were overwhelmed within seconds, and explosions began to blossom throughout the alien fleet. Marcus watched the battle
unfold on the holographic display and felt no
satisfaction in the destruction. This was not about revenge or conquest, but about survival. The Velcrans had come to enslave humanity and they had to be stopped. The silent response had lured them into position, and now the real answer was being delivered in fire and fury. The void of space erupted into chaos as human weapons found their targets with devastating precision. Commander Greg Patterson stood on the bridge of the EDF Sentinel and watched his tactical display fill with explosions. His ship had been hiding in a cloud of frozen gas for 3 days, and now it was finally time to fight. He gave the order to fire, and the Sentinel's main batteries spoke with controlled fury. Directed energy weapons carved glowing lines across the darkness and sliced through Velcran armor. Missiles launched from their tubes and streaked toward enemy vessels with single-minded determination. Around the Sentinel, dozens of other human cruisers were doing the same thing. Each ship had been assigned specific targets, and each captain executed their orders with professional calm. This was not a chaotic brawl, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. The Velcran fleet tried to respond, but they were fighting from a position of complete disadvantage. Their ships had been arranged for visual impact rather than tactical efficiency, and now they paid the price for their arrogance. Enemy vessels collided with each other as they tried to maneuver, and their weapons fire was wild and uncoordinated. Zethus screamed orders at his bridge crew and demanded that his ships return fire. Some of the Velcran commanders managed to get their weapon systems online, and they began shooting at the human fleet. A few hits landed and human ships reported damage, but nothing critical. The problem for the Velcrons was that they had designed their tactics around fighting inferior enemies who were already demoralized and desperate. They had never faced an opponent who was calm and prepared and absolutely determined to win. Jake dove his fighter through a cloud of debris that had once been a Velcran battlecruiser and locked onto his next target. Enemy fighters were launching now and trying to form defensive screens around the capital ships. He counted at least 50 hostiles in his immediate area and knew that Amy was somewhere nearby dealing with her own targets. A group of 3 Velcran fighters spotted him and turned to engage. Jake remained calm and calculated the intercept vectors in his head. He had flown combat simulations against Velcran tactics hundreds of times, and he knew their standard attack patterns. The enemy fighters opened fire too early and their weapons missed by a wide margin. Jake waited until the last possible moment and then broke hard to the left. Amy came in from the right and caught 2 of the Velcrans in a crossfire. The third enemy pilot tried to flee, but Jake was already on his tail. The brief dogfight ended with all 3 Velcran fighters destroyed, and Jake suffered only minor damage to his port wing. He reported the kills to his carrier and requested new targeting assignments. The battle was far from over. On Mars, Claire monitored the effectiveness of the railgun strikes and adjusted firing solutions in real time. The initial volley had destroyed or crippled 18 Velcran capital ships, and the second wave was already in flight. Her targeting computer suggested focusing on the enemy carriers next to prevent them from launching more fighters. Ryan agreed with the assessment and ordered all guns to retarget. The massive weapons swiveled on their hidden mountings and prepared to fire again. Each shot required enormous amounts of power, and the Martian power grid was being pushed to its absolute limits. The second volley launched, and more kinetic projectiles screamed through space toward their targets. The Velcran carriers tried to maneuver, but they were too large and too slow. One by one, they were struck by impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons. Zethus watched his fleet die around him and could not comprehend what was happening. His tactical officer reported that they were down to 60% combat effectiveness, and the number was dropping every minute. Hundreds of his crew were dead and thousands more were injured. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it quickly. Retreat was an option, but it would mean admitting defeat to a species that was supposed to be primitive and weak. The Velcran Dominion had never retreated from battle, and his reputation would be destroyed if he ordered it now. Pride warred with survival instinct in his mind, and for precious seconds, he hesitated. Those seconds cost him 20 more ships as human weapons continued their relentless assault. Finally, he accepted the truth that this battle was lost and there was no shame in surviving to fight another day. He opened a channel to all remaining Velcran ships and gave the order to retreat. Every vessel still capable of faster-than-light travel was to jump immediately to the rally point. The others would have to surrender and hope for mercy from the humans. Greg watched as about 40 Velcran ships began to power up their jump drives. He had anticipated this move and already positioned units to intercept. Human destroyers moved to block the escape routes, and their weapons targeted the enemy engines specifically. Several Velcran ships managed to jump away before they could be stopped, but most were caught and disabled. Their faster-than-light drives were destroyed, and they were left drifting helplessly in space. The human fleet surrounded them and waited. Jake saw the Velcran fighters begin to disengage and fall back toward their carriers. Some of the enemy pilots were trying to surrender by shutting down their weapons and broadcasting on open channels. He held his fire and reported the situation to his commanding officer. Amy flew up beside him, and they watched as the battle wound down. The space around them was filled with debris and escape pods and the occasional flash of exploding fuel. It had been 6 hours since the first shot was fired and the human victory was complete. On the Velcran flagship, Zethus stood amid the ruins of his bridge and counted the cost of his defeat. 300 ships had entered human space and now only 73 remained. Thousands of his people were dead and many more would die if they did not receive medical help soon. His communications officer reported that life support was failing on several ships, and they needed immediate assistance. Zethus swallowed his pride and opened a channel to the human fleet. For the first time since arriving in this cursed system, he would speak directly to the enemy. Marcus listened to the alien's voice and heard the desperation in it. The Velcran commander was begging for help and offering unconditional surrender. It was the response that Marcus had expected from the beginning, but the aliens had needed to be shown that humanity would not be intimidated. He waited a full minute before responding, and let the silence stretch out. The Velcrans needed to understand that communication was a privilege and not a right. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and professional. He acknowledged the surrender and ordered all Velcran ships to power down their weapon systems completely. Human boarding parties would secure each vessel before any medical assistance was provided. It was harsh but necessary because Marcus could not risk treachery. Zethus agreed to all the terms without argument and began issuing orders to his surviving ships. The Velcran fleet went dark and waited for the humans to take control. It was the most humiliating moment of his long career, but he was alive and his remaining crew would survive. Jake landed his fighter back on the carrier and climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Amy landed beside him and they shared a look of relief that they had both made it through. The hangar deck was organized chaos as fighters returned and damage control teams rushed to repair wounded ships. Jake walked to the debriefing area and submitted his report. 7 enemy fighters destroyed and 0 friendly casualties in his squadron. It had been a good day. Human boarding teams moved through the disabled Velcran ships with weapons ready and medical supplies prepared. Captain Peter Grant led one of the teams onto the enemy flagship and found scenes of devastation everywhere he looked. The corridors were filled with smoke and the smell of burned electronics and the sounds of wounded crew members crying out in pain. His team moved methodically through the ship and secured each section before moving to the next. They encountered no resistance because the Velcrans were too injured and too defeated to fight. Peter saw alien crew members huddled in corners and staring at the human soldiers with expressions of fear and confusion. The medical personnel who followed the boarding teams began treating the wounded immediately. Human doctors worked alongside Velcran medical staff, and language barriers were overcome through necessity and compassion. Lives were saved that day regardless of which species they belonged to. Zethus was found on the bridge and he surrendered his sidearm without protest. Peter accepted the weapon and offered the alien commander a chance to remain on the bridge while his ship was secured. It was a gesture of respect from one military officer to another. The Velcran looked at the young human captain and asked the question that had been haunting him since the battle ended. He wanted to know why humanity had not responded to the original ultimatum. Peter considered his answer carefully before speaking. He explained that Admiral Grant had understood the psychology of the situation. The Velcrans expected fear and negotiation because that was what every other conquered species had shown them. By refusing to respond at all, the humans had created uncertainty and confusion in the enemy's mind. More importantly, the silence had bought time. While the Velcrans waited for a response that never came, the human fleet had moved into position and prepared the trap. Every hour of silence was another hour for preparations to be completed. Zethus absorbed this information and realized that he had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. The humans had studied his tactics and predicted his responses and exploited every weakness in the Velcran military doctrine. It was humbling and terrifying to realize that the primitive species had outsmarted him so completely. On Earth, President Helen Morris addressed the planet in a broadcast that was transmitted to every human colony. She explained that the alien threat had been neutralized and that humanity had won a decisive victory. The news was met with celebration in some places and relief in others. But Helen also warned that this battle was just the beginning. The Velcran Dominion controlled 47 star systems and enslaved billions of sentient beings. Earth had made an enemy of a galactic power, and there would be consequences. Marcus stood beside her during the broadcast and added his own assessment. The human fleet had performed brilliantly, but they had also been lucky. The Velkrans had underestimated them and paid the price for their arrogance. Future enemies might not make the same mistake. He proposed that humanity use this victory as an opportunity rather than just celebrating it. The freed Velkran ships could provide valuable intelligence about the Dominion's military capabilities and political structure. More importantly, Earth needed to decide what message to send to the rest of the galaxy. The decision was made to return the surviving Velkran ships to their home territory with an escort. One human destroyer would accompany them and deliver a message directly to the Velkran High Council. It was a bold move that carried significant risk, but the potential rewards were worth it. Captain Nathan Cole was chosen to command the EDF Arizona on this mission. He was young for a destroyer captain, but he had distinguished himself during the battle. More importantly, he had the diplomatic skills necessary to navigate what would certainly be a tense situation. Nathan met with Admiral Grant before departing and received his orders. The mission was simple in concept but complex in execution. He was to escort the Velkran survivors home and deliver humanity's demands to their government. If the Velkrans attempted to attack or detain him, he was to defend himself and retreat. The Arizona departed from Earth orbit 3 days after the battle ended, and the Velkran ships followed in a ragged formation. Many of them were barely spaceworthy, and their crews worked around the clock to keep critical systems functioning. Nathan kept his weapons powered but not targeted as a show of caution rather than aggression. The journey took 2 weeks, and during that time Nathan had several conversations with Zethus. The Velkran commander was surprisingly forthcoming about his government and military. Perhaps it was defeat that made him talkative, or perhaps he simply respected the human captain enough to be honest. Zethus explained that the Velkran Dominion was built on a foundation of conquest and intimidation. They believed that strength was the only quality that mattered, and that mercy was a weakness to be exploited. Every species they had encountered had either surrendered or been destroyed. Nathan listened carefully and took notes. This information would be valuable for Earth's intelligence services and diplomatic corps. He also shared some information about humanity in return, because he wanted Zethus to understand that Earth was not interested in building an empire. The Velkran home system came into view, and Nathan felt his pulse quicken. Dozens of warships were in orbit around the planet, and they immediately moved to intercept the returning fleet. The Arizona held position and waited to see what would happen. Zethus transmitted a full report to the High Council and explained what had occurred in human space. The reaction from the Velkran leadership was shock and disbelief. They demanded that Nathan bring his ship into orbit so they could discuss the situation. Nathan agreed but made it clear that his ship would remain at full combat readiness. He transmitted the sensor data from the battle to prove that the Arizona was not alone. 40 human ships were currently hidden throughout the Velkran home system, and 400 more were ready to jump in if needed. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. The Velkrans had no way to verify whether the claim was true, and after what had happened to their fleet, they were not willing to take the risk. The High Council agreed to receive Nathan's message without attempting to detain or harm him. The council chambers were impressive and intimidating, with high ceilings and walls covered in the banners of conquered worlds. Nathan stood before the assembled Velkran leadership and delivered Admiral Grant's message without emotion or embellishment. Earth demanded that all conquered species be released immediately and allowed to govern themselves. The Velkran military would withdraw to their original borders and dismantle their offensive fleet. Any future aggression toward human space or their allies would be met with overwhelming force. The High Counselor listened to these demands with barely contained rage. He asked what gave humanity the right to dictate terms to a civilization that had ruled the stars for thousands of years. Nathan's response was simple and direct. Humanity had earned that right by defeating the Velkran fleet in battle. Might did not make right, but it did make reality. The Dominion could accept these terms and survive, or they could refuse and be destroyed. There was no third option. The council chamber erupted in angry voices, and several members demanded that Nathan be arrested immediately. The High Counselor raised his hand for silence and considered the situation carefully. He was a politician before he was a warrior, and he understood when he was beaten. He asked for time to consider the demands, and Nathan granted him 72 hours. It was the same amount of time the Velkrans had given humanity, and the irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The meeting ended and Nathan returned to his ship. For 3 days, the Arizona remained in orbit while the Velcran government debated. Nathan received reports from his sensor operators that the enemy fleet was preparing for battle. He calmly transmitted coordinates to Earth and requested that the reinforcement fleet be ready to jump on his command. On the 3rd day, the High Council sent their response. They would comply with all of humanity's demands. The subject species would be freed, and the military would be reduced to defensive forces only. It was a complete capitulation, and it sent shockwaves throughout the Dominion. Nathan acknowledged the message and prepared to depart. Before leaving, he had one final conversation with Zethus. The Velcran commander asked what humanity would do now that they had humbled a galactic power. Nathan smiled and said that Earth would do what it had always done, protect those who could not protect themselves. The news of the Velcran defeat spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and the reaction was a mixture of shock and hope. 47 enslaved species suddenly found themselves free after years or decades or even centuries of oppression. The galaxy would never be the same. On Earth, Admiral Marcus Grant watched as representatives from the freed worlds began arriving. They came in battered ships that barely functioned and wore clothing that showed signs of poverty and hardship. But their eyes held something that had been missing for too long: hope. The first delegation was from a world called Tarna, and their people resembled tall, thin birds with brilliant plumage. Their spokesperson was named Kesh, and she spoke through a translation device in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. She thanked humanity for their courage and asked if Earth would help protect her people from future threats. Marcus explained that humanity was not interested in replacing the Velcrans as galactic overlords. Earth wanted peace and cooperation rather than conquest and domination. However, he also said that humanity would not stand by while innocent species were enslaved or destroyed. Other delegations followed with similar requests. Some wanted military protection, while others sought trade agreements or technological exchange. A few simply wanted to establish diplomatic relations and learn more about the mysterious species that had defeated the Velcran Dominion. President Helen Morris worked with her advisors to develop a framework for these new relationships. The result was the Mutual Defense Coalition, which guaranteed military support to any member world that was attacked without provocation. Membership was voluntary and came with responsibilities as well as benefits. 17 species joined the coalition in the first month, and more were applying every day. Earth provided military training and defense technology, while member worlds contributed resources and knowledge. It was a partnership built on equality rather than domination. The human fleet expanded rapidly to meet the new commitments. New ships were built and new crews were trained, and the military budget increased dramatically. Jake was promoted to squadron leader and found himself training pilots from half a dozen different species. Amy became an instructor at the new Coalition Defense Academy, where human and alien officers learned to work together. The cultural differences were sometimes challenging, but the common goal of protecting their homes brought them together. On Mars, Ryan oversaw the construction of similar railgun systems for Coalition member worlds. The technology was shared freely because Earth understood that a strong defense for one world meant greater security for all. Claire was sent to Tarna to help set up their planetary defense network. The Velcran Dominion watched these developments with growing concern. Their empire had collapsed almost overnight, and their subject species had fled to join the human coalition. What remained was a much smaller territory and a military force that was a shadow of its former power. Zethus had retired from active service, but he was called upon to advise the High Council on human capabilities. He told them the truth without embellishment. Humanity was not like other species, and they did not think like other species, and any future conflict would end in Velcran defeat. The Council accepted his assessment and chose a path of cautious peace. They withdrew to their core systems and focused on rebuilding their shattered military for defensive purposes only. Some counselors dreamed of revenge, but they were wise enough to keep those thoughts to themselves. Nathan remained in Velcran space as Earth's permanent ambassador. His mission was to monitor compliance with the peace terms and maintain open communication with the Dominion government. It was delicate work that required equal parts diplomacy and vigilance. He developed a working relationship with several Velcran officials who were genuinely interested in reform. These moderates understood that the old ways had led to disaster, and that their civilization needed to change if it wanted to survive. Nathan supported them quietly while watching the hardliners carefully. 6 months after the battle, a crisis emerged when a Velcron hardline faction attempted a coup. They seized control of several military bases and declared their intention to rebuild the offensive fleet. Nathan immediately transmitted this information to Earth and requested instructions. Marcus responded by sending a small task force to the border of Velcran space. The ships did not enter the system, but their presence sent a clear message. Any return to aggressive expansion would be met with force. The coalition also issued a statement, supporting the legitimate Velcran government. The coup collapsed. Within days, when the moderate faction received support from both the Velcran population and the galactic community, the hardliners were arrested and the crisis ended without bloodshed. It was a defining moment that showed how much had changed. On Earth, Marcus stood before the diplomatic corps building and reflected on everything that had happened. The silent war had been won not with words but with actions, and the galaxy had learned that humanity could not be intimidated or conquered. Lisa joined him at the window and commented that people were calling this the dawn of a new era. Marcus agreed, but cautioned that the future was never guaranteed. Peace required constant vigilance and the willingness to defend it when necessary. The defense fleet maintained its patrols throughout coalition space, and human ships were always ready to respond to threats. The galaxy had learned one lesson, but there were always those who needed to learn it again. Strength and compassion were not opposites, but complementary forces. Jake led his squadron on a patrol of the Outer Rim and marveled at how much had changed. A year ago, this region had been threatened by an overwhelming alien fleet, and now it was protected by a coalition of species working together. His wingman was a Tarnan pilot named Vesa, who flew with skill and courage. They detected a distress signal from a freighter under attack by pirates. Jake coordinated with Vesa, and they jumped to the location together. The pirates fled when they saw military vessels approaching, and the freighter was saved. It was routine work, but it mattered to the crew who would have died without help. Amy taught a class of new pilots from 6 different species and explained human combat tactics. The students were eager to learn and brought their own experiences to share. She realized that Earth was not just protecting the coalition, but learning from it as well. On Tarna, Claire watched as the first railgun installation went online and felt pride in what they had accomplished. The Tarnan engineers had learned quickly and taken ownership of the project. This was their defense system now, and they would maintain it and improve it. Back in Velcran space, Zethis looked up at the stars and thought about the lessons he had learned. The most dangerous warrior was not the one who shouted loudest, but the one who watched in silence and struck when victory was certain. Humanity had taught the galaxy that strength came in many forms. He wondered what the future would bring and whether the peace would last. The Velcrons had been humbled but not destroyed, and some among his people still harbored dreams of revenge. Zethis hoped they would never act on those dreams because he knew how that story would end. The stars looked different now to many beings across the galaxy. They were no longer just points of light in the darkness, but homes to species who refused to be enslaved. Somewhere out there, humanity watched and waited and prepared to defend the peace they had won. Marcus received a report that 3 more species had applied to join the coalition. He approved their applications and made arrangements for defense consultations. Earth had never sought to rule the galaxy, but they had become guardians of its freedom. The silent war had ended, but its echoes would resound for generations. Humanity had shown the galaxy that strength without arrogance was possible, and that the most powerful message sometimes came without words. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the galaxy had hope.